Two states opting to legalize, celebrities publicly endorsing and toking. Public opinion on the recreational use of marijuana seems to be liberalizing. But is pot as harmless as many suggest? Joining us now to answer that and other questions tonight, in New York, Dr. Carl Hart. He's professor of psychiatry and psychology at Columbia University. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Kevin Sabat, former senior advisor to the Obama administration at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. He's now director of the Institute on Drug Policy at the University of Florida. And with us here in studio, Alan Young, professor of law at the Osgoode Hall Law School, and Dr. Harold Calant, professor emeritus of toxicology and pharmacology at the University of Toronto. And it's good to welcome you two gentlemen here in the studio, our two friends in the United States. We appreciate your being on the line from New York and Washington. Let's start with this. We talked about Washington and Colorado, those recent elections that they held in those states. Public opinion surveys in Canada show that 65% support the legalization or the decriminalization of marijuana. We've got a Gallup poll in the United States that finds that 62% of people ages 18 to 29 favor full legalization. Only 31% of senior citizens believe that. Alan, let's go to you first. How do you regard this shift towards a more pro-marijuana stance?
I actually don't think it's a shift. In Canada, the statistics have been clear since really 1972 that close to 70% of Canadians want a change in the law. Most of it's decrim, not legalization. There was a lull in the 80s, the Reagan era, just say no, people didn't talk about things, and there was a resurgence in the 90s, but it was the same public opinion. This has been about a failure in democracy because a majority of Canadians and Americans have wanted a change since 1972. So I don't see it as a shift, I just think it's more pronounced right now.
Kevin, how do you regard it?
Well, I think the devil's in the details. First of all, there's a huge difference between legalization, which would open the door to massive production and commercialization, which is really what I worry about. I don't want to see another tobacco industry targeting kids, and decriminalization, which would remove criminal penalties. I don't use either term. They're both confusing and vague. I think change is fine, but let's think about how to do that in a health paradigm versus these sort of sound bites. And so that's why I'm welcoming this discussion today.
Carl, do you think there's been a shift in attitude towards drug, either decriminalization or legalization over the past 25 years?
Well, I have to agree with Alan. I think that in general, people have been more supportive of marijuana, certainly decriminalization. As Kevin said, he doesn't like to use those terms. I think it's important because they have huge implications in terms of who goes to jail, who gets a criminal record, and who doesn't. Given that marijuana is our most frequently used illicit drug, they have huge implications. And so we clearly agree with Kevin in that we don't want industries or various organizations targeting kids because let's not forget that these are psychoactive drugs. And I don't think anyone is arguing that we should have more availability for kids.
Harold Calant, where are you on this issue of public opinion shifting over the last couple of generations?
No, I would agree with Alan, too. I think all along it was clear that most people don't think kids should be sent to jail for possessing an ounce or so of marijuana.
How are you defining kids?
Adolescents, teenagers.
Teenagers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think everyone agrees that that sort of really strict law, or punishment rather, doesn't help society. On the other hand, as Kevin said, having the drug more readily available, making it much easier to use, especially making it easier for young people to buy it, is not something that most people would recommend.
So, Steve, if I could...
Go ahead, Kevin. I hear you trying to get in.
Sure. I think what's important is that we want, a health-oriented approach doesn't actually fall very neatly in either of these extremes, which is unfortunately what the media debate and others have framed it as. Either you're in favor of throwing people in jail or legalizing marijuana. And I don't actually think that the science is at either of those two extremes that we often are told to be, we have to fit into one of those boxes neatly. I think one of the key statistics, though, to understand is, and I'm not familiar with the Canadian figures as much, but I suspect they're not going to be more draconian than in the US, is that most people are not in jail, let alone kids, in jail or in prisons, I should say, for small amounts of marijuana when that's their only issue. So people are put in for multiple things. Marijuana is usually tacked onto that. Most people have to appear before a judge the next week, usually pay a civil fine and get on with it. What I think Carl was saying, which I would agree with him, is that the issue becomes on arrest records. So there's a difference between going to jail, which doesn't really happen for marijuana, but if you do have an arrest record, that could prevent you from, in terms of jobs, in terms of getting social assistance. And there are some states like New Jersey that actually have a program where your record is expunged after 6 to 12 months of abstinence and then you move on. I think those models would make sense. And so it's important to have a sort of adult civil conversation where we can discuss these specifics rather than get into this media narrative of you're either lock them up or legalize. The truth is not in either of those extremes.
Carl, did you want to follow on that?
Yeah, I think that, again, Kevin is mostly right, but we need to take seriously this notion that in the U.S., for example, there are more than 800,000 arrests every year for marijuana. Right. And when people get a blemish on their record, the likelihood of them coming back from that blemish is really low, particularly when we start looking at certain ethnic and racial groups. I mean, so I think Kevin, you're downplaying the impact of the sort of legal sanctions related to marijuana.
Kevin, you want one more time at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Carl, I don't get me wrong here. I think that that is an important issue, and that's why I brought it up. A lot of people will ignore it. It is an important issue, the blemish on your record, and that's why I think we need to look at how our laws are structured and how that happens. But I was just sitting down with an African-American leader for a major national organization in the U.S., and what he said was, if a war on drugs is defined as mass incarceration, that is not good for my community, and I agree with that. But he also said if the war on drugs shift means that it's going to be a similar attack with what we have with alcohol, when we have liquor outlets that are 3 to 5 times in greater density in underserved neighborhoods, and specifically Hispanic and African American neighborhoods in the U.S. versus upper class neighborhoods. And that's because those businesses in that industry of addictive substances like alcohol, tobacco, and by the way, even things like the lottery, target the underclass, target the poor and the dispossessed. And that doesn't help their situation either. So, we need to be looking at both.
Let me jump in here. Alan Young wants to quickly. Stand by a sec, Carl. I want to hear Alan Young for a second.
Okay, very quickly.
I think this is important because, first of all, the person who makes these comments, I don't know what that person's expertise are. And I think that what we do when we focus on that issue, we are actually skirting around the issue that we have at hand. And we're talking about marijuana, and we're talking about marijuana arrests. And that's the major thing that we're worried about, and not this other sort of issue.
Okay, understood.
Well,
Alan?
we can skirt it without legalizing.
It's not whether it's about prison or about arrest. Right. There's an earlier question. Should this be against the law? Because in principle, should you label a young person or an adult as a criminal for doing something that ostensibly is not harming society? That's the question. If you say there's harm, then it doesn't matter there's prison or arrest. It's deserving. So you got to get back to the primary question of why we're doing this in the first place.
When you say doesn't harm society, and I want to let's pick up on that a little bit. Through your work, Harold Calant, can you tell us categorically whether we know that if you smoke a cigarette and you do it too much, you're going to get cancer? Can you say that about marijuana?
You mean, will you get cancer?
Correct.
No, that's still up in the air. There are studies both ways. Some studies have reported a clear significant link between smoking marijuana and developing upper airways cancer, with the risk being proportional to how much you smoked. Other studies have shown no link to cancer, but a clear link to chronic respiratory irritation, bronchitis, chronic bronchitis, and impaired respiratory function. But I think one mustn't forget that marijuana, like any drug, has actions that may be beneficial, that may be therapeutic, and has actions that may be harmful. Marijuana is not a magical substance. It's the same as all other drugs in terms of potential good and potential risk. But the problem is where the balance is.
I was just going to ask that. On balance, if moderately used, is it riskier or less risky?
If it's, it depends on what you mean by moderately used.
Right.
Okay, maybe you should tell me.
Well, you see, if the definitions are different for marijuana and for tobacco, it's assumed that most people who smoke tobacco smoke something getting close to a pack a day or more. Nobody smokes that much, or very few people smoke that much marijuana. The question is, at what level do you begin to see harm? And in general, the feeling is that if you're a regular smoker, that if you smoke at least once a week, and usually more often than a week, you are in the range which is capable of producing harm.
Alan?
I do remember Harold Calan testifying on our trial that moderate use leads to no significant risk of harm. So the question is, what is moderate?
Exactly.
So that's going to be a debate. But I do want to say very quickly, the cancer issue is really a red herring. The evidence is not there. Dr. Tashkin has gone through this carefully and showed.
Who's Dr. Tashkin?
He's at UCLA and done a very big longitudinal study. Here's why the cancer thing is mythical. We're now finding that cannabinoids have anti-tumor or tumor-reducing properties, and I know he wants to respond to that. This is one of the most exciting things about cannabis medically. So if it has some tumor-reducing properties, it can't at the same time be carcinogenic. And so that's what I think the mythical part is.
Harold wants one
No,
more shot at this.
that's not, I'm afraid I have to disagree. with
Yeah, go
Alan.
ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead, Harold.
The range, the concentration range or the dosage range is very different for those two types of effect. The anti-cancer effect has been shown only in the test tube or in animals with tumors implanted into them and injecting the cannabinoid right into the tumor. In humans, there's been no evidence of an anti-cancer effect at the ranges that people smoke.
But you have to admit it's exciting, and it should be looked at. This could be the next great panacea.
That's fine,
So
but
Steve-
it is not relevant to smoking
Okay,
cannabis.
I understand.
I think I hear
that's
Carl
right,
trying to
and-
get in.
Yeah.
That's right, and we don't want to think about cannabis as being magical. I mean, I think the point was made very well that just like any other psychoactive drug, we have to take this seriously, and it has positive effects and negative effects.
That's right.
And when we think about weighing these different types of effects, we have to look at the risk-benefit ratio. I mean, if you're sucking burning weeds down your throat, we can expect that you might have some negative effects. The same is true with drinking alcohol and the potential toxicity to the liver. But there are beneficial effects with alcohol. It's been demonstrated that alcohol is associated with fewer strokes, fewer heart disease, and a wide range of things. But there's also that potential for the negative effects on the liver. The same is true with marijuana.
Let me get Kevin on this.
Yeah, so I think we need to separate the medical and therapeutic potentials, as I think the previous speaker did, and the harmful effects. I mean, we have a whole host of medications that are therapeutic that we also know are harmful. The opiates are a perfect example. Morphine is derived from opium. It doesn't mean that we ask people to smoke opium to get that therapeutic effect of morphine. We've isolated morphine. We deliver it in a way that you don't have to inject it in your arm with a needle, or you don't have to smoke it to receive the benefit. And we can do and I agree actually with Al as well. It is an exciting area of research. I mean, the medical side of it. Cocaine also has medical properties. That's why it's a Schedule II drug in the United States. There are ways that we need to separate it. On the health harms, though, which I think was the original question, of course, I agree with the previous statements that all drugs, have their harms, et cetera. But when we know, for example, the longitudinal scientific studies have been shown that for kids, if you initiate marijuana use, in other words, in adolescence, it's about a 1 in 6 chance of producing a dependence or addiction. That means 5 out of 6 kids won't produce that, which is, you could look on the bright side, but that also means for that 1 out of 6, that can be a very serious issue. So it can be a serious issue with mental illness. We know with all of the studies, in the twin studies done where one side of the twin smokes and the other one doesn't, and all the other factors are the same, the twin that smokes is much more likely to acquire mental illness like schizophrenia and psychosis. 400,000 people a year, or 400,000 ER admissions, emergency room admissions, are for marijuana, many of those for psychotic episodes. Doesn't mean that everybody does that. And so people often generalize their own experience, whether it's from last week or back in the 60s heyday when marijuana was 5 times weaker than it is now,
Sure.
thinking that everyone's going to be fine with it. And I think that's a problem. Doesn't mean that we need to overreact. We should just look at the science. And on drugged driving, it's another huge issue. People are now more high than they are drunk in California when it comes to driving. Tobacco, by the way, has no driving aspects. That doesn't mean tobacco is more, safer, more harmful, or whatever. It just has different elements of harm. So we need to
Okay,
keep
Harold
that in mind.
Calan wants to get in here.
Yeah, Kevin has just made a whole series of points, all of which I agree with. I think there are a number of things to be remembered. One is that all psychoactive drugs are potentially more dangerous in young people. Cannabis has been, THC, for example, the active ingredient in cannabis, has been shown to impair maturation of nerve cells in immature subjects, both human and experimental animals.
So if you're 12, you shouldn't be toking.
That's right. And on the other hand, the whole history of drug evolution has been that, going back centuries, that people began with plant materials or natural materials for which they found activities. And the trouble was with all of them, as it is with cannabis, that they have adverse effects too. And in order to make the drug action more specific, safer, more effective, they've moved away from crude plant materials to pure single compounds, which can be targeted very specifically towards particular parts, receptor types in the body. And I think that the medical benefits of cannabis, the direction that they're going to follow will be going away from crude cannabis to artificial compounds which are highly selective for specific organs, specific tissues, and to produce a greater potency of therapeutic effect with less risk of side effects.
Alan, a follow to you?
Yeah,
Can I comment on that?
Stand by, Carl. Carl, stand by. I got
Okay.
Alan and then you.
Yeah, very quickly, I don't want anyone to believe I advocate for underage drug use, because I do advocate for legalization. But hearing something Kevin said, it reminds me of the Twain thing about lies, damn lies, and statistics. He says 1 in 6 young people develop dependency, and that's troubling. But in Canada, I can't speak to the United States, it's very clear that only 2%, or less than even 2%, use it daily. So how do you jive
know
those
that?
two? The CAMH statistics, I forget the study. It was actually in our case, and it was done by Patricia Erickson. It's definitely less than 5%. Our study was
That's completely consistent with
1.6% of young people use daily and 0.6% of
agree.
adults. So how do you get that figure on dependency when so few people are using it on that degree of
You easily
regularity?
can. This is the issue: is it's 1 in 6 if you've used it once as an adolescent, and addiction doesn't necessarily mean you're also going to be using it every day. But they meet the clinical criteria, and this isn't just statistics sort of out of the air that we sort of are making up. These are, this is the National.
I hear you,
Institute of
but you
Health,
just
it's
changed the
World
word
College
to
of
addiction.
Physicians. I mean,
You
yeah.
said dependency
Well, this is the
first. So which is
yeah.
it? Because they're very different things. And addiction's far more
Well-
serious than dependency.
No, I would have to
this
disagree with
is
that.
addiction according to NIH. So
Yeah.
I misspoke before.
Okay, Carl wanted to get in. Let me hear Carl.
I wanted to comment on the move in medicine towards more specific medicines or medicines that specifically target, say, receptors. I think that's an overstatement. I mean, obviously, that's what we want to do, and that's certainly the sort of theoretical underpinnings of what we do. It drives what we do, but medications have multiple effects. And this notion that they have these specific effects, it's misleading, and it's not even honest. And so obviously that we like to have specific effects, but most of our medications do not. They have a lot of non-specific effects. That's one. And two, when we think about adolescents here, particularly when we're talking about legalization, we're talking about legalization for adults. We don't want adolescents to use any of these illegal drugs
I
or
think you're all saying
psychoactive
that.
drugs.
Yeah.
You're all
Yes,
saying that.
yes, but
Right.
exactly. But I want to make sure that we focus on the issue here. The issue is in adults.
No, fair
No,
point.
but
Harold,
Carl,
you
Right,
wanna
but
say?
Carl, it's
Carl,
completely irrelevant because alcohol is legal if you're over 21, and many more kids drink than they smoke marijuana. The issue is when society sanctions something and tries to put as many controls over it as possible. We see today with alcohol, despite our best efforts, kids are getting alcohol way easier, and they're using it in higher rates than they are with marijuana. Now,
More
with
kids
tobacco,
in North America use marijuana than in Holland, where it's readily available. So legalizing
that's
or
a totally
liberalizing
different
does not
issue.
increase use.
Okay.
Wait,
Stand by. I want to hear
comparing the
Harold,
United
please.
States or North
Can I hear
America
Harold
and
here
Holland
for a second?
is a completely different issue.
Harold, your turn.
Okay, two things. Carl misunderstood what I said. I didn't say that drugs now are specific. I said the direction of evolution of drugs is away from crude substances, natural plant materials, towards more specific things. And it's true that the adverse effects of drugs very often are due to lack of specificity, but the way in which we have moved is away from coarse mixtures, crude mixtures, towards pure compounds for which we can make them by synthetic modification, make them more specific. That's the target.
While you have the floor, can I ask you this?
Sure.
In the same way that, say, 1 glass of red wine can be helpful to your heart if you do that on a daily basis, can you say something similar about the use of marijuana insofar as if you do it once a week, once every few days, it will be helpful to X, Y, and Z part of your body?
In theory, yes, sure. There's no evidence that I know of that has shown that there's greater health or longer life if you do smoke marijuana infrequently, as you describe. But in principle, I can't see that it's impossible, no. Because it does have effects. For example, it has an anti-anxiety effect. It has an effect of diminishing allergic reactions or immune system reactions. It does, well, it will diminish the effects of stress, just as small amounts of alcohol will too.
Right.
But
Enhances sleep.
It enhances sleep, exactly. But nobody has yet produced the statistical evidence that they have for alcohol to show that a small amount is actually beneficial to the large number
But
of
the
people.
issue for public policy isn't benefit, it's harm. And I do want to say this. In human population studies, large scale done in the 70s in Costa Rica, Jamaica, and Greece, no increased morbidity or mortality in marijuana smokers versus the ordinary population. That's the most important fact to know. Yes, I think there's benefits. I think Harold's right. We don't know exactly what they are. We only known about the receptors since 1988. But we have to know, is it sufficiently harmful for criminal law? And those human population studies show it isn't.
So, Carl, is it
Well,
an
that's-
important thing to have? Let me get this from Carl. Is medical marijuana then, for example, an important tool for a physician to have in his or her toolkit?
Absolutely. When we think about medicines, some people have pointed out, and they correctly have pointed out, that there are many medications that are available that's better than marijuana for some of the proposed elements for marijuana. Now, when we think about the toolbox, physicians have multiple tools for each sort of element, and marijuana just becomes another tool in that toolbox. I agree with Alan in that we are moving away from the crude sort of compounds like smoking marijuana. But at this point, it seems to me that having this important tool in the toolbox is necessary. But when we think about why marijuana is illegal, we can't really have this conversation without thinking about why marijuana is illegal in the first place. And that's where we haven't dealt with that yet. But we can deal with this issue of medical marijuana first.
Okay, yeah, let's do that first. Let me get
Steve,
Kevin
can
and then Harold on that. Go ahead, Kevin.
So two quick points. But first of all, the studies that were referred to from the 1970s, I mean, we should be basing public policy on the science of, you know, the 2000s and what we've learned. We have learned so much in the last 40 years in terms of marijuana's negative effects and the stuff on IQ diminishing. I mean, the 8-point decline in IQ
That's
that
a
you
New
start and
Zealand
use regularly
study, right?
as a kid. Right, the famous New Zealand studies you referred to. I mean, we're not going to list them all the issues here, mental health, driving, et cetera. But the issue is, so we need to base it on the current science as opposed to, you know, back in the 70s when the drug was a completely different drug than the drug that we have today. Producers and traffickers have manipulated and learned to manipulate with lighting and other growing techniques the core composition of marijuana insofar as it does not resemble the marijuana, the cannabis that was, you know, used, and I admit, of course it was used thousands of years ago. They have downplayed any ingredient that takes away the high, and they have increased the high of the THC. On the second point, though, on medical marijuana, just to make this, it depends what we mean by medical marijuana. I mean, we throw this term out all the time. If we mean like what we would medical opium, in other words, morphine or those derivatives, the non-smoked, we don't smoke any medicine. So the non-inhaled, non-smoked, non-crude, as the doctor mentioned earlier, components of marijuana, I think that is a very worthwhile endeavor. In fact, in Canada, and Canada is ahead of the U.S. on this, and I commend them, they have approved already an oral mouth spray of 2 active ingredients in marijuana. It's actually an extract. It's not even a synthetic. It's an extract, and that's called Sativex, and that's a combination of THC, the active ingredient, and also another cannabinoid we're learning about called CBD, cannabidiol. That is extremely promising for multiple sclerosis spasticity and also for neuropathic cancer
And
pain.
what's it
That is totally different than medical marijuana, smoking joints, and having what you have in California, which are, you know, 23-year-olds with no medical background selling, you know, super silver haze because people voted on medicine. That latter system, which is a reality, not an exaggeration, I don't think it should be a model for medicine. I think the former, doing this in a proper scientific way and opening up the research, and it should be, is the proper way to do it.
Harold Caland.
Yeah, I would agree with Kevin. I would prefer that the term medical marijuana disappear, because there's no such thing as medical marijuana. There's marijuana which can be used for medical.
Clients out of patients to make out of prison to make that distinction.
No, well, the point is, it's either used for medical purposes or it's used for non-medical purposes. But the marijuana is marijuana.
I see.
And he's quite right. There are the pure cannabinoids such as THC and similar compounds which have all of the actions of marijuana. And there's CBD, which has some of the actions but don't have the psychoactive effects that are responsible for much of the unwanted side effects of crude cannabis. And that again gets towards the point of breaking a mixture down into individual compounds so that you can be more specific in what you are using for a therapeutic purpose without running into the risk of the side effects.
Alan?
I just want to respond to a couple of things Kevin said, which isn't just about medical marijuana, but marijuana in general. He threw in a bunch of things really quickly, and I have to address it. First, he did say it's addictive. I just want to say for the record, there is no evidence it's addictive. And NIDA in the United States, let me finish, has tried for 30 years to prove this. The worst you're getting is a withdrawal like from caffeine. And if that's what is addiction, then I'm not concerned about that. No one has ever robbed a bank because they've run out of marijuana. That's addiction, when you run out of heroin and you want to get money for it.
I got a guy who's been in the business 50 years beside you who says that's just not the case.
He can say what he wants. I'm going to talk from a personal experience. I've never met anybody who... Dependency is a real problem. People have psychological dependency. They need marijuana for part of their life, but no one has ever been able to say, I have almost died withdrawing from marijuana. It's a mild headache.
It's not addictive like cocaine, but it's maybe a little addictive?
You get a dependency. Look, you get used to it in your body, so you have a change. I know from personal experience and from my friends, we have periods where we don't consume. There might be a day where you don't sleep well. That's it. So I read these studies. I don't know where they're coming from. They tried for 40 years to do this. Let me just finish for a second.
Second point.
Second, he says, over the last 40 years, there's been better studies. That's nonsense. We did most of the research and heavy research in the 70s when middle-class kids were using it, and we wanted to know whether we should come down hard on them. There's been more studies on medical value than there has been on harm, and I'm not sure which studies other than the New Zealand one, which was mentioned, that he's talking about that change it. Final point, marijuana is different than my father's marijuana or my mother's marijuana. I keep hearing that's nonsense. THC levels may be higher, so you smoke less. Plus, we also measure THC differently than we did in the 70s because we add something called the THC acid to it, so the numbers will be higher. So I'm just not sure about a lot of these points you throw out to sort of create the impression that marijuana is dangerous, but not really saying it, just sort of alluding to it. And I think a lot of
marijuana can be dangerous for people. I mean,
anything
are you
can
saying
be
marijuana is
dangerous.
not?
No, I'm saying that it's got a great safety margin. That's all I'm saying. Anything has a risk. 40,000 Americans injure themselves every year in their toilet seats, but we don't consider toilet seats dangerous. Same thing with marijuana.
I think I need more information about
can I
that.
get in?
Yeah,
How
it
does
was a
that happen
national
exactly?
poll. Also, 100,000 injure themselves on their clothing.
How do 40,000 people harm themselves on the toilet?
Probably falling in.
I don't think we want to know. Okay, let me hear. I hear Carl
visuals.
trying to get in. Let me get Carl, and then we'll get Harold.
Yeah, I think we are throwing around a lot of terms that we have definitions for in medicine. Alan, I understand your concern, and I actually share some of your sort of feelings about this. But when we think about addiction, we define it based on ICD criteria and DSM criteria. And certainly, there are people who smoke marijuana who can meet these criteria.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that.
It's a small number of people, but they certainly can meet these criteria. That's one. Kevin mentioned the study in New Zealand. And I think we should talk about that because we are here to talk about the evidence. And I think that study has been talked about in a way that it is the landmark study, or it's
Carl, let me get in
really
here for a
rigorous.
Second. Forgive me, Carl. I want to get in here for a second because for those who don't know about New Zealand, let me take 20 seconds just to explain, and then we'll hand it right back to you. It was a recently published study out of New Zealand, decades long, more than 1,000 New Zealanders, and researchers found that adolescents who used marijuana at least 4 days a week lost an average of 8 IQ points if they're between the ages of 13 and 38. And that is a pattern that is not seen among people who began smoking heavily only in adulthood. Carl, I hand the dais back to you now.
Yeah, so that study had some problems with it. First of all, if we had a study that showed the other direction, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And,
We'd be having it
and
10
this is,
times over, I think.
I don't think we would.
I agree.
And this is, hang on, this is one study, and there were some serious problems with this study. Because if you look at the data quite closely, when you look at the people who never smoked marijuana, and the starting out IQ in those folks is lower than the IQ of people who smoked marijuana. And then when you look at those people who smoked marijuana but didn't meet criteria for dependence, their IQ is still higher than those folks who never tried marijuana. When you look at those data very carefully, you start to see that this is not as convincing as people, the media, has made it out to be. The actual study authors.
To be convincing.
Good point.
Yeah, it's actually the scientists that made it out to be convincing. They had controlled for every single thing that you just mentioned, and also, you know, I know.
No. You're not looking at. You are not looking at those data. You're not looking at those data. If you look at those, no, hang on. I mean, if you look at those data, the most convincing sort of difference you see is between a group of people who make up 17 folks, and the other group make up 19 people. With those low numbers, this is extremely preliminary.
We'll
Kevin,
talk
would you
about it
grant
over
that?
espresso in New York.
Kevin, would you grant that these are preliminary data and you don't want to take it to the bank just yet?
This is absolutely not preliminary data. I mean, these are health experts from around the world who do not have views on policy that said this is the most comprehensive landmark study. They followed people for 30 years, 2 entire villages in New Zealand from people born in the year 1972 and 1973, controlled for all of these things, Carl, I'm sorry, that you're talking about.
No. You are not looking at the data.
Than other drugs, or this is the only basis
for which we should make policy. You are not looking at the data.
Gentlemen, sorry, can't have you both talking at once.
Like I said, Carl, let's talk about it over espresso in New York.
Okay, stand by. Let me hear from Harold. Hang on, haven't heard from Harold in a while, please.
Yeah.
Harold, your turn.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't agree with the definition that you gave of addiction.
I have a behavioral definition, not the DSM definition.
I agree with Carl. It's the addiction is dependence and addiction are used interchangeably, and they are as defined in the ICD-10 and the DSM-4, and
What's the ICD-10?
International Classification of Diseases.
Okay.
That's the UN publication.
DSM we've talked
and the
about here many
DSM
times.
is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders by the American Psychiatric Association. And they're even talking now for the DSM-5 of changing back from dependence to addiction because it has a clearer meaning. And it does not mean physical dependence as shown by a withdrawal reaction. That doesn't kill people.
But that's what makes your behavior compelling to do something to get the drug.
I'm sorry, this is not what is the essence of addiction. The essence of addiction is the inability to stop when you have adverse effects. You want to stop, you try, you succeed until you fall, you relapse again. As Mark Twain said, smoking, it's easy to stop smoking. I've done it many times.
There's lots of things people can't stop, Carl. Dr. Collin. Yeah, sorry, Harold. There's lots of things people can't stop. It's a question of what the impact is on society. And yes, the DSM-4 has their classifications, but they're very low. There's a difference between needing something so badly that your body hurts that you're going to mug someone on the street. That's a social problem we have to deal with. Marijuana, I've never heard anything like that.
Tell me this, though, Alan.
That doesn't happen.
Does the use of marijuana affect your ability to drive a car?
Absolutely.
No, I would not drive because I have respect for other drivers. But looking at the studies, the deviance from ordinary standard driving is quite small. There's also the suggestion that people are more cautious. The bottom line is, all prescription drugs that say you shouldn't drive, you shouldn't drive. But I know lots of people who do and drive very well, but I just don't think it's a counsel of prudence to do it.
Policy and science can't be based on I know people who did this or my experience.
I'm also talking about the Netherlands study, the Robbie study.
The British Medical Journal just did the most comprehensive meta-analysis of drugged driving, focusing on cannabis related to reaction time, related to depth perception, related related to all these risk factors for crashes. And the British medical's, agnostic on this policy issue, but their final conclusion on driving was that people who are impaired, who are under the influence of cannabis, of marijuana, have double their car crash risk, period. That is what they said after looking at all the data.
Steve,
Because
Harold,
there's THC
Harold,
in their
hang on.
blood, which doesn't mean current intoxication.
Let me hear Harold and then Carl.
Kevin is just, I agree completely with him, because in addition to what you've referred to, there is now quite a collection of statistical articles on fatalities in motor accidents.
That's right.
With,
Oh, yeah, that's exactly right.
with culpability studies, which show that when an accident occurs with a driver who has been smoking pot, the culpability is much more likely to be on the part of the marijuana-influenced driver than on the other driver.
I see. Carl, you wanted in.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I do. I'm the only one here who has actually done studies in which we've actually given people marijuana and then we tested their cognitive functioning. I mean, I don't think that anybody would argue that somebody should smoke marijuana and get behind the car of a wheel while they're intoxicated. Nor would we argue that somebody should take OxyContin or another opiate and get behind the wheel of a car and operate it. I mean,
Precisely.
I think that's clear.
Okay.
But when we start to think about, if we want to talk more broadly about marijuana's effects on cognition, short-term and long-term, that's more interesting, I think.
Okay, we're down to literally a minute and a half to go here, and I want to go around the horn, so to speak, and find out, although I think we know already, what your views are on legalizing. Carl, would you start us off here? 15 seconds to each of you. Yes or no to legalizing marijuana?
Yes.
Alan Young?
We have to legalize. It's a tragic waste of resources and a disservice to young people.
Kevin Sabet?
Absolutely not. We've learned our lessons from tobacco advertising, from alcohol. We can't devise a model that works. Let's fix the wrong parts of our current policy and move forward with a health strategy.
Harold Calant?
Rather than answer the question, I'd like to raise one other important point. It is for the whole society to decide, and to decide sensibly in a democracy. They should be well informed of the facts, not just either for or against.
No, but you've helped inform us of the facts, and based on
Well,
that,
I
what
based on
would you
those-
do?
I don't think so. I think one of the things we failed to do is talk about why marijuana was illegal in the first place.
And
I'm
it was
still waiting to
illegal.
hear Harold's response to legalization.
Yeah, I've got 30 seconds left to find out from
Okay.
Harold whether he's for or against legalization.
Personally, I don't think that the benefit of legalizing is great enough to warrant the risks. If society as a whole decided that they wanted to, it's not the end of the world.
Okay.
But the decision should be made with full knowledge that there are not only benefits, but
course.
risks which are serious.
Okay, let me acknowledge to
Good point,
Carl,
Greg.
we didn't get to the point that you wanted to, Carl. We never get to it all here, even though we try. And the other thing is, I think it's pretty obvious that none of you were toking before this program, because that's as hyper a discussion as we've had in these parts in quite a long time. So thanks for showing up to the show clear-headed. Carl Hart in New York, New York. Thanks so much for being there on the line from the Big Apple.
you, guys.
Kevin Sabet out of the American capital city, Washington, D.C. How's the fiscal cliff going anyway? That's another show. Harold Calant.
No comment.
From the University of Toronto. Alan Young, Osgoode Hall Law School. Great of all of you to join us
Thank
tonight.
you.
Thanks so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.